In this video, I'm going to provide a short overview of conflict mapping, sometimes called conflict actor mapping, one tool that you can use to analyze conflict. Conflict mapping is a visual tool that helps us to identify the parties involved in the conflict and how they relate to each other, power relationships, and outside forces that may be influencing the party. The process for developing a conflict map includes the following steps. First, you identify and list all of the parties. This includes the primary parties who are in conflict, any secondary parties who may be impacted by or influencing the conflict, and tertiary parties, sort of spectators or other people that are involved and may influence the situation, but to a lesser extent. Then, you determine the parties with the most power, and determine the parties with the least power. And you draw this by actually making the shapes that you use to describe the parties sort of different sizes. After that, you go about determining the nature of the relationships between parties, and there's lots of different ways to do that. After that, you identify any outside forces at play, time or institutional pressures or other things that may be impacting the way the conflict is operating. Lastly, you look at your map as a whole to identify any strategic points of entry. That is, you identify if any parties need to be added to the conflict, such as mediators or respected persons of authority, any relationships that need to be addressed, or outside forces that can be reduced or maybe even used productively to help make the conflict more constructive. When you're done all of this, you will end up with something that looks a little bit like this. Okay. Let me show you this in a little bit more detail, just kind of using a hypothetical conflict situation. In this hypothetical conflict, we have two primary parties engaged in conflict, Party A and Party B. You will notice that Party B is drawn much larger than Party A. This is to indicate that, in this situation, Party B has more power than Party A. There are also two additional secondary parties involved in the conflict, Party C and Party D. Both of these parties have relatively less power in this situation. Now that we have all the parties, we can go into identifying the nature of the relationships between them. The conflict is primarily between Party A and Party B. We generally indicate that with a jagged line. A double line indicates a strong relationship and alliance between parties. So in this case, we have an alliance between Party A and Party C. We can show a broken relationship by having a connecting line with a line through it. So in this case, there is a broken relationship between Party B and Party C. Other relationships can be indicated with a simple single line. So in this case, there is a relationship between both Party A and D and Party B and D. Lastly, we can think about any outside forces that may be impacting the conflict. In this case, there is one strong outside force that is actually impacting Party B. We can show it this way. Now that we have all the parties in place, we can look for any strategic points of entry, or to draw from the language of systems thinking, high leverage points. These are key points in the conflict system that can be engaged with to help make the conflict more constructive. There are actually two in this case. Can you see them? I'll give you a minute. Here's one. Party D has a relationship with both of the conflicting parties. This indicates that this party might be able to act as a mediator or otherwise help facilitate more constructive conflict processes. Did you see the other strategic point of entry? Looking at the map, you can see that there is a major outside force impacting Party B. This outside force could be leading Party B to engage in more dysfunctional or destructive conflict behaviors. Maybe Party B is under intense time pressure, or maybe there are other parties that are pressuring Party B to handle things in particular ways. Recognizing this pressure, empathizing with what Party B is dealing with, and maybe helping them deal with it, could help to direct the conflict in a more constructive way. Now, when you make a conflict map, you're really just taking a snapshot of the current state of the situation. As you work with the conflict, you may need to go back to it and make adjustments as things change. Alright, so let me show you an example of something from my own life. My husband and I got married in 2013. We were lucky enough to have two sets of parents, both of whom were willing to help pay for the wedding. However, this also meant that our parents had a vested interest in many aspects of the wedding. One surprisingly heated conflict arose around our wedding invitations. Now, my mother is Ukrainian and Italian, and as some people from that cultural background might know, it is sometimes customary to write the word presentation at the bottom of a wedding invitation. This means that the couple is actually requesting gifts of money rather than actually physical gifts from guests. So if you ever get an invitation and it says that, you now know what you're expected to do. In fact, there are actually several customs associated with how much money you should give, factoring in things like whether there will be a cash bar, the nature of the menu, etc. So anyways, my mom really wanted this on the invitation. However, I didn't, and Kevin and Kevin's family didn't. And this situation actually led to really significant conflict. This conflict was primarily between my mother and I. In this instance, I am drawing my mother in a way that indicates she had more power than I did in this situation. That's why her circle is bigger. Her power came primarily from the financial resources she was offering. Now, there were also other parties involved in this conflict. My husband, Kevin, was a secondary party. That is, he was invested in the outcome of the conflict and impacted by it, but he wasn't necessarily involved directly. We were in an alliance in this particular case. Kevin's mom was also involved. Again, she's being drawn a little bit larger here because she also had more power in terms of having more financial resources. During this particular conflict, she was influencing Kevin, stressing the importance of not putting the term presentation on the invitations. Our respective fathers were also involved, in this case mainly acting as allies and support for the mothers. So overall, this would be the most obvious aspects of this conflict. There were also some latent conflicts. First off, there was a latent conflict between Kevin and my mother, given that he really wasn't that fond of the way that she was treating me or dealing with the issue. But he never said anything to her to indicate that this conflict existed. Similarly, there was a conflict between the two mothers. This was kind of an ongoing thing that had to do with a whole bunch of different issues, but they never really addressed anything openly, so it stayed latent. There are also several outside pressures impacting the conflict. Time was a big one. We had to get the invitations printed and mailed out by a certain date, so this time pressure impacted most of the parties. Cost was also a significant issue, primarily impacting Kevin and me. We couldn't really afford to print the invitations ourselves, so we were dependent upon one of the parents to do so. This created a power imbalance that impacted the whole conflict. Lastly, there was another major latent outside pressure. Specifically, my grandfather, that is my mother's father, passed away around the same time that this issue came about. I think, and again I'm guessing because we never really talked about it, that this actually really impacted me and my mom. It made issues of culture and family more important to her, while making both of us more emotionally fragile. On top of this was another sort of major pressure or factor. This was the issue of distance. Basically, while our wedding was going to happen in Ontario, where all of our parents live, Kevin and I were living in Winnipeg, so we were planning everything from a distance. This meant that most of the communication was done through phone and email. The only time my mother and I actually talked to face was when I was briefly at home to attend my grandfather's funeral. Not the best time to try to deal with this type of conflict. Okay, so looking at this conflict map, can you see any strategic points of entry? Two things actually happened in this case. First, Kevin's mother offered to pay for the invitations. This didn't resolve the conflict, but shifted the power relationships, giving Kevin's more financial power and my mother less. For Kevin and me, this actually removed cost as one of the major forces impacting the conflict. However, what really helped to address this particular conflict was the inclusion of an additional party. Basically, I brought in an expert. I suggested that my mom talk to someone who specializes in wedding invitations, knowing that this person was likely to suggest that putting the term presentation was not really something that was fashionable or common anymore. This actually worked. My mom called me up and casually said something along the following: "So, Julie, we're not going to put presentation on the invitation anymore, because it really isn't something that's done that often." I just let her believe that it was her idea, and this effectively removed the conflict. Now, was this a perfect example of how to handle conflict? No, definitely not. I would say that this specific conflict episode around the issue of invitations, it was resolved. However, there were many latent issues and many relational issues that were not addressed. In fact, I would say that this left all of the parties, the parents, Kevin, and myself, more wary of each other, and made many subsequent conflicts more challenging. But given the overall situation, along with a bunch of the other factors, including the nature of the relationship between my mother and I, which is challenging at times, taking all this into consideration, I think it was handled fairly competently. And that is something to remember about conflict competence. It is not about handling things perfectly, based upon some kind of abstract criteria. It's about handling things as well as possible, given the situation. Okay, to summarize, conflict mapping helps you to visualize parties, relationships, power, and outside forces. It is a kind of static system map that helps you to identify possibilities for intervention. To develop one, again, follow these basic steps. Identify and list all of the parties. Determine the parties with the most power. Determine the parties with the least power. Draw this. Determine the relationships between parties. Identify any outside forces at play, and identify any strategic points of entry. In addition, if you find that these particular guidelines don't really work for your conflict, feel free to change it up. Use different colors, different shapes, different lines and patterns. Do what makes the most sense for you. I encourage you now to take a few minutes to play with this. Pause the video so you can see the steps maybe, and develop your own conflict map based upon a conflict that you have been experiencing.